The air at Miller's salvage yard hung thick and heavy, a cocktail of rust, stale oil, and the ghosts of engines long dead. For most folks in Blackwood County, this was a place of endings, a graveyard where good iron came to be picked apart by vultures looking for a cheap alternator or a usable tire. But for Silas Blackwood, it was a library. Every rusted-out hulk, every silent engine block held a story, a lesson in engineering that you couldn't learn from a glossy brochure down at the dealership. He was wrestling a greasy steering knuckle from the remains of a '58 Chevy pickup, his knuckles already scraped raw against the oxidized metal. The part was for his own truck, a tired but faithful servant that, like everything else Silas owned, was paid for in full. That was the Blackwood way. His father, old Jedediah, had hammered it into him from the time he could hold a wrench. Debt is a chain, son. You let the banker put it on you, he owns you. You own the land, you own the iron, or you ain't a free man. A shadow fell over him. Still digging in the boneyard, Blackwood. Thought a man with 160 acres would have better things to do. Silas didn't need to look up. The voice was as slick and smug as the new paint on the machine it belonged to. Warren Slater. He straightened up slowly, wiping a smear of grease from his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a dark stripe on his sun-weathered skin. Slater stood there, arms crossed over his chest, a brand-new Pioneer seed cap perched on his head. He looked like he'd just stepped out of a Farm Journal advertisement. "Just keeping the old stuff running, Warren," Silas said, his voice low and even. "Costs less that way." Slater let out a short, derisive laugh. "Costs you time. Time is money. My new International 1066, now that's a moneymaker. Put 500 hours on it since spring and haven't so much as broke a sweat. The bank was happy to write the check, said it was a smart investment." Silas just nodded, turning his attention back to the stubborn bolt on the knuckle. He knew all about Slater's 1066. You could hear its turbo whistle from 2 miles away. It was a fine machine, no doubt. But it wasn't Slater's, it was the bank's. Slater was just the man lucky enough to sit in the seat for now. "You ought to come into the modern age, Silas," Slater went on, kicking at a loose hubcap. "That old Farmall M of yours belongs in a museum. You can't make a living turning 2 furrows at a time." "It gets the job done," Silas said, finally freeing the part with a grunt and a sharp crack of rusted metal. "And when it breaks, I can fix it with what I've got in that toolbox." Slater just shook his head, a look of pity on his face that infuriated Silas more than any insult. He was about to walk away when his eyes caught something deeper in the yard, past the rows of dead cars and combines. It was a mountain of faded yellow iron, half swallowed by weeds and Virginia creeper. A shape from another era. Ignoring Slater, Silas walked towards it. The thing was a monster, a tracked vehicle, a bulldozer, with a heavy, straight blade that looked like it could push the world aside. Rust had streaked its flanks in long, weeping trails, but beneath the decay was the unmistakable look of solid, unkillable steel. The engine cowling was gone on one side, revealing the guts of a massive diesel engine. The tracks were sunk a foot into the mud, the steel pads looking like the vertebrae of some fossilized beast. "What's the story on this old girl?" Silas called over to Frank Miller, the yard owner who was watching from the door of his corrugated tin shack. Miller ambled over, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. That's an old Alice Chalmers HD6. Been sitting there since before my daddy bought this place. Some logging outfit went bust in the 50s and just left it. Engine seized tighter than a banker's fist, I reckon. Tracks are froze solid. It's 10 tons of scrap iron is what it is." Slater followed, a smirk playing on his lips. "What in God's name would you want with that thing, Blackwood? Planning on grading yourself a path to the poorhouse?" Silas didn't answer. He ran a hand over the cold steel of the blade. It was pitted and scarred, but it was over an inch thick. He walked around the machine, his mechanic's eye taking in the damage. The final drives were massive, encased in heavy cast iron. The undercarriage was worn, but the sprockets and rollers were immense, built for a lifetime of abuse. He peered into the engine bay. It was a Detroit diesel, a 2-stroke screamer by the looks of it. A 371 maybe. Greasy, covered in pine needles and dirt, but all there. Seized, Miller had said. That could mean anything from rusted rings to a thrown rod. He was thinking about the 40 acres of bottomland on the back of his property. It was rich, black soil, but it was a tangled mess of scrub oak, cottonwood, and swamp maple. Every spring, the creek overflowed and turned it into a mosquito-infested bog. If he could clear it, dig a proper drainage ditch, he could gain another 30 acres of prime cropland. 30 acres that could mean the difference between getting by and getting ahead. He'd gotten a quote from a contractor to do the work a few years back. The price was so high he'd laughed, then felt sick to his stomach. But this machine, if he could get it running— "You're dreaming, Silas," Slater said, reading his mind. "It would take you a year just to get that thing to make a noise, and another year before it moved. I'm clearing my new 80 next spring. Got a guy with a new Cat D8 coming in. Be done in a week. That's how you do it. You spend money to make money." "I'll give you $200 for it, Frank," Silas said, his eyes still fixed on the dozer, ignoring Slater completely. Miller choked on his tobacco. "200? Son, it'll cost you that much in cutting torch gas to bust it up for scrap." "It's worth more to you sitting here, sinking into the mud," Silas countered. "I'll haul it out myself. It'll be gone from your yard. 200 cash." Miller scratched his whiskered chin. He looked at the dozer, then back at Silas's determined face. He knew that look. It was the same look old Jedediah Blackwood used to get. Stubborn as a mule chewing on a thistle. 400, Miller grunted. "And you're responsible for getting it out of here. If it sinks to China, it's your problem." 300, Silas said, "and I'll throw in this steering knuckle I was about to pay you for." A slow grin spread across Miller's face. "You got a deal, Blackwood. I want to see the look on your face when you try to move this beast." Slater was laughing openly now. "You just paid $300 for a lawn ornament, Silas. My wife will be sure to send a casserole over when you finally go broke." He tipped his fancy cap and walked away, shaking his head, the crunch of his clean boots on the gravel a sound of pure condescension. Silas watched him go, a slow fire burning in his gut. He turned back to the silent, rusted machine. It was more than just a piece of junk. It was an idea, a possibility. It was a way to fight back without signing his name on a banker's dotted line. It was his Declaration of Independence, all 10 tons of it. He didn't know if he could bring it back to life. He didn't know if the engine was salvageable or if the transmission was a boat anchor. But he knew he had to try. It was the only way he knew. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of resurrecting this old iron giant, I have to ask you all a question. What's the oldest, most hopeless piece of equipment you've ever brought back from the dead? A tractor, a truck, a chainsaw that had been left in the rain for a decade? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing those stories of stubborn men and stubborn iron. Getting the HD6 home was a war in itself. It took Silas a week just to figure out how to do it. He couldn't afford a proper lowboy trailer, and nobody he knew had one big enough anyway. In the end, it was a masterpiece of country engineering and sheer grit. He borrowed a heavy-duty winch from a neighbor, bolting it to the trunk of a massive oak tree at the edge of the scrapyard. Using a series of snatch blocks to multiply the pulling force, he spent 2 full days just breaking the tracks free from the sucking mud they'd been entombed in for 20 years. The sound of the rusted track pins groaning and popping echoed through the yard like gunfire. Then came the problem of transport. He ended up hiring a local flatbed hauler, a guy named Gus who usually moved logs and had a truck with a winch that could pull a house off its foundation. But the dozer was too wide for the trailer. Silas had to spend another day unbolting the blade, a job that required a 3/4-inch impact wrench he borrowed from the co-op, a 6-foot cheetah bar, and every curse word he knew. The bolts were frozen solid with rust, each one a battle of sweat and leverage. Finally, they loaded the main body of the dozer onto the flatbed and chained the blade down separately. The truck's tires squatted low under the immense weight, and Gus drove the 5 miles to Silas's farm at a crawl, flashers blinking, a procession for a dead king. He had them set it down behind the barn, near his workshop, and there it sat, a monument to what everyone in the county was now calling Silas's folly. Cars would slow down on the county road to get a better look. He could feel their eyes on him when he was out in the fields on his old farmall. He could hear the whispers when he went into town for supplies. Poor Mary, they'd say about his wife, married to a man who'd rather polish a piece of junk than buy a decent tractor. Mary, to her credit, never said a word against it. She saw the look in his eye, the same determined fire his father used to have. She just made sure he had a hot meal waiting for him when he finally stumbled in from the workshop late at night, smelling of diesel and penetrating oil, his hands stained black. The real work began. First, he had to assess the heart of the beast, the Detroit Diesel 371 engine. Detroit two-strokes were legendary. They were called Screamin' Jimmies for the incredible noise they made at full throttle. They had a reputation for being tough, oily, and temperamental. Silas drained what was left of the oil. It came out like black sludge, thick and gritty. A bad sign. He pulled the valve cover. Underneath was a layer of hardened, cooked-on oil, but the rockers and injectors seemed to be intact. The big test was turning it over. He put a 4-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt at the front of the engine and leaned into it with all his weight. Nothing. It was seized solid. He soaked the cylinders for a week, pouring a mixture of automatic transmission fluid and acetone down through the injector ports. A home-brewed, penetrating oil he swore by. Every day he'd go out and try the breaker bar again. Every day it was like trying to move a mountain. The community scorn only grew. Warren Slater made a point of driving by in his shiny new pickup truck, sometimes with the banker, Mr. Abernathy, in the passenger seat. Silas would see them slow down, point at the Dozer, and then drive off laughing. It was a public humiliation. Slater was leasing another 100 acres now, talking big at the diner about yields and profits, about how a man had to be aggressive to survive. And there was Silas, covered in grease, fighting a losing battle with a dead engine. He was becoming a cautionary tale, a symbol of the old ways that were dying out. The nights grew colder as fall set in. After a full day of harvesting his corn, Silas would head straight to the workshop, his body aching with fatigue, and work on the Dozer by the light of a single bare bulb. He pulled the head off the engine. It took a chain hoist to lift the massive piece of cast iron. The sight underneath made his heart sink. The cylinder walls were scored with rust. Water had gotten in through the exhaust stack years ago and pooled on top of the pistons. The rings were rusted directly to the cylinder sleeves. It was worse than he had feared. Any other man would have given up, called the scrap man, and admitted defeat. But Silas Blackwood was his father's son. Defeat wasn't in his vocabulary. He decided the engine had to come out. It was a brutal, filthy job. He disconnected the massive transmission, the hydraulic pumps, the fuel lines. Using the Farmall's loader and a series of chains and blocks, he painstakingly hoisted the 1,000-pound engine block out of the Dozer's chassis. He tore it down piece by piece on the concrete floor of his shop. Pistons, connecting rods, crankshaft, blower. He laid each part out on old feed sacks, cleaning, measuring, inspecting. The news wasn't good. The crankshaft was salvageable, but it would need to be turned. The cylinder sleeves were shot, completely pitted with rust. The pistons were junk. It needed a full rebuild, and the parts for a 50-year-old Detroit diesel weren't something you could just pick up at the Napa store. He spent the winter on the phone, calling salvage yards and specialty suppliers across the Midwest. He traded a cord of firewood for a set of used sleeves from a guy in Wisconsin. He found a new old-stock set of pistons in a dusty warehouse in southern Illinois. He drove his old Chevy 100 miles to have the crankshaft ground and polished at a machine shop that specialized in heavy equipment. Every part cost money they didn't have. Money that should have been going towards a new planter or repairs on the barn roof. Mary started selling more eggs at the farmer's market and took in some mending from the church ladies just to make ends meet. The pressure was immense. One cold February night, he was trying to press a new wrist pin into a piston, a delicate operation that required heating the piston and chilling the pin. He was tired, his hands were numb from the cold, and he misjudged the alignment. There was a sickening crack. The piston, one of the irreplaceable ones he'd spent $100 on, split right down the side. He just stood there, staring at the broken piece of metal in his hand. The weight of it all came crashing down on him. The long hours, the frozen fingers, the mocking laughter from Slater, the worried look in his wife's eyes. He let out a roar of pure frustration and hurled a heavy wrench against the workshop wall, where it clanged and crashed to the floor, leaving a dent in the wood. He slumped down onto an overturned bucket, his head in his hands, the silence of the cold night pressing in on him. For the first time, he truly believed he was beaten. Maybe Slater was right. Maybe he was just a fool chasing a ghost. The boom years of the early 70s were in full swing, and it seemed like everyone was getting rich, but Silas Blackwood. In 1973, after the massive grain deal with the Soviet Union, corn and soybean prices shot through the roof. The fields of Blackwood County turned to gold. Farmers who had been struggling for years were suddenly flush with cash, or at least flush with credit. The banks, eager to loan against the inflated value of land, were handing out money like it was candy at a parade. And nobody was taking more candy than Warren Slater. The first thing Slater did was buy the 80 acres bordering Silas's farm to the west, the old Henderson place. It was good land, and Silas had always dreamed of buying it himself one day, if he could ever scrape together the cash. Slater didn't scrape. He walked into the bank, signed a piece of paper, and the land was his. A month later, a brand new John Deere 4630, 150 horsepower of gleaming green paint and modern technology, was delivered to his farm. It made his old 1066 look like a toy. Slater's operation was the talk of the county. He traded in his old 6-row planter for a new 12-row Deere Max Emerge. He bought a bigger disc, a bigger field cultivator. He put up 2 new grain bins, their shiny corrugated steel glinting in the sun, symbols of his prosperity. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, all of it leveraged to the hilt. At the grain elevator, he'd hold court, talking about futures markets and depreciation schedules, things Silas barely understood. He treated Silas with an air of patronizing pity, as if he were a relic from a bygone era. "Still tinkering with that pile of rust, Silas?" he'd ask loudly so everyone could hear. "You know, I could give you a fair price for your place, cash you out. You could move to town, get a nice easy job, no more busted knuckles." The offer was an insult wrapped in a thin veneer of concern, and it made Silas's blood boil, but he'd just nod and walk away. There was no point in arguing. In the eyes of the world, Slater was a genius, a visionary. And Silas, with his paid-for farm and his ancient equipment, was a failure who was too stubborn or too stupid to see the opportunity right in front of him. Meanwhile, in the quiet solitude of his workshop, a resurrection was slowly taking place. After the night he broke the piston, Mary had come out to the shop. She didn't say anything, just put a hand on his shoulder and handed him a hot cup of coffee. That simple gesture was all he needed. The next day he was back on the phone, and by some miracle he found a single used piston in a salvage yard in Nebraska. It cost him dearly, but it was the last piece of the puzzle. He spent the rest of the winter assembling the engine with the precision of a watchmaker. He honed the new sleeves, checked the bearing clearances with Plastigauge, torqued every bolt to spec. He rebuilt the blower, cleaned every port, and timed the injectors until they were perfect. By the time the first spring thaw came, the big Detroit diesel was bolted back into the Dozer's frame. He connected the fuel lines, bled the system, and hooked up 2 heavy-duty truck batteries. He stood on the track, his hand on the starter button, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. A year of work, all their spare cash, his entire reputation in the county, it all came down to this moment. He took a deep breath and pushed the button. The starter groaned, turning the massive engine over slowly, reluctantly. 1 revolution. 2. Then a cough of black smoke shot from the straight exhaust pipe. Another cough. And then, with a deafening roar that shook the very ground, the 371 engine exploded into life. It wasn't a smooth, modern sound. It was a violent, clattering, bellowing symphony of combustion, the signature 2-stroke howl of a screaming Jimmy. The sound of raw, untamed power. Smoke filled the workshop, but it was the sweetest smell Silas had ever known. He let out a whoop of triumph, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that was drowned out by the glorious noise of the engine he had brought back from the grave. Getting the Dozer moving was another series of battles. The steering clutches were frozen, requiring him to tear apart the entire rear end. The hydraulic system was full of contaminated fluid and blown seals. He spent weeks wrestling with 100-pound track pads, replacing worn pins and bushings. But with the engine running, he had a power source, and more importantly, he had hope. By midsummer of 1974, while Slater was driving his air-conditioned 4630 across his vast, bank-owned fields, Silas was taking the first ceremonial drive on his Resurrected HD6. It was slow, loud, and clumsy, but it was alive. He drove it out of the workshop and pointed it toward the overgrown bottomland. He dropped the heavy blade, pushed the throttle forward, and for the first time, the 10-ton machine bit into the soil of his farm. It tore through saplings and thick brush as if they were nothing, the old Detroit engine howling its defiance. The progress was slow. He could only work on it in the evenings and on weekends, after his real farm work was done. Clearing 40 acres of tangled wilderness with a 50-horsepower Dozer from the 1950s was a monumental task. But acre by painstaking acre, the land began to change. He pushed over trees, scraped away the undergrowth, and piled it all into massive burn piles that lit up the night sky. He was reshaping his own land with his own two hands, with a machine he had paid for in cash and rebuilt with his own sweat. He owed no man anything for it. The grain boom continued, and Slater's empire grew. He bought another farm. He built a new machine shed that was bigger than Silas's house. He was the poster boy for the new age of agriculture. Silas, covered in dirt and grease, wrestling with his old Dozer, was seen as an eccentric at best, a fool at worst. The interest rates from the Federal Reserve had started to tick upward, from 4% to 5%, then to 6%, but nobody seemed to notice. The price of corn was still high, the bankers were still smiling, and the new iron kept rolling off the delivery trucks. One evening in the late fall of 1976, Silas shut down the Dozer and stood on the track, looking out at his progress. He had nearly 20 acres cleared. The rich black soil lay exposed, waiting for the plow. In the distance, across the fence line, he could see the headlights of Slater's newest and biggest tractor, a massive four-wheel drive Steiger pulling a 24-foot chisel plow, working late into the night on the land he'd just bought. The machine moved with an effortless speed and power that made his own efforts seem pathetic. A cold wind blew across the fields, carrying with it the smell of rain and the first hint of winter. Something about the scene felt wrong. The frantic pace of Slater's work, the ever-rising cost of fuel and parts, the nervous look he'd seen on the banker's face last week in town. It all felt like a fever that was about to break. He looked at his own land, the part he had tamed, and then at the dark, tangled wilderness that still remained. The fight was far from over. He didn't know it yet, but the easy times were ending, and a storm was gathering on the economic horizon, a storm that would wash away the proud and the foolish and spare only the prepared. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was a whisper. It came in the summer of 1979 in the form of a sky that turned a brassy, unforgiving yellow and simply refused to rain. The corn in Silas's fields, planted in soil he had carefully nurtured, began to curl its leaves during the heat of the day, a thirsty prayer for a drink that never came. He cultivated deeper than usual with the old farm awl, trying to break the crust and conserve what little moisture was left, the steel wheels of the tractor kicking up clouds of fine, choking dust. Across the fence, Warren Slater's operation was showing its own kind of strain. His massive center pivot irrigation system, which he'd installed on a quarter section of rented ground, ran day and night, a hissing, wheeled serpent spitting precious water onto the thirsty corn. But the well it drew from was dropping, and the big diesel generator that powered the pump drank fuel at a terrifying rate. The price of diesel had nearly doubled in a year, a fact that Silas felt every time he filled the small tank on his M, but for Slater it was a hemorrhage of cash. Then Slater's new combine, a gleaming red International Harvester 1460 axial flow, broke down in the middle of his wheat harvest. It wasn't a simple fix, not like a broken belt on Silas's old pull-type Alice Chalmers. A complex hydrostatic drive pump had failed. The dealership mechanic had to come out from the city, and the part had to be special ordered. For 5 critical days, the combine sat idle while the wheat got drier and the sky threatened a storm. Silas saw Slater out there, pacing a circle around the silent red machine, his face a mask of frustration. The bill for that repair, Silas heard later at the co-op, was more than he'd paid for his first tractor. Silas kept working his own land. The drought hit his yields hard, but his costs were low. He didn't have an irrigation pump to feed or a massive combine payment to make. The 30 acres of bottomland, cleared by the HD6, were his saving grace. The soil there was deep and black, holding moisture like a sponge. While the corn on his upland fields was stunted and pale, the corn in the bottoms was dark green and tall, its roots sunk deep into the rich earth he had liberated. That fall, the whispers grew louder. The Federal Reserve, trying to fight rampant inflation, was cranking up interest rates. 8% became 10, then 12. Farmers who had borrowed heavily on variable rate loans suddenly found their payments ballooning. The talk at the diner shifted from record yields to crushing debt loads. The bankers, who had been all smiles and handshakes a few years before, now wore grim, tight-lipped expressions. The first cracks in Slater's empire appeared not as a single shattering blow, but as a series of small grinding fractures. He was late paying his bill at the fuel co-op. He put off buying new tires for his Steiger, running the old ones until the cords showed. He sold off a small herd of cattle he'd bought as an investment, taking a loss just to generate some cash flow. He drove his pickup faster, his jaw perpetually clenched. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive anger. One afternoon, Silas was working near the fence line, replacing a few rotten posts. Slater pulled up in his truck, dust boiling up behind him. "You heard about the grain embargo?" Slater asked, his voice raw. He didn't wait for an answer. "President Carter's stopping all sales to the Soviets, just like that. Cut the legs right out from under the market." Silas straightened up, leaning on his post-hole digger. He had heard. The price of corn had dropped 30 cents a bushel overnight. For Slater, with his thousands of bushels stored in those shiny new bins, that represented a catastrophic loss of income he had already borrowed against. "It'll come back," Silas said quietly. "Come back?" Slater laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Abernathy at the bank just called. He wants to review my financial position. You know what that means, don't you? He's getting nervous. After years of telling me to get bigger, to leverage my assets, he's getting nervous." He gestured wildly at Silas's farm, at the modest house and the old weathered barn. "You're lucky, you know that. Too damn stubborn to get with the times. Sitting here on your little patch of dirt, paid for, while the rest of us are trying to feed the world and getting crucified for it." He slammed his truck into gear and sped away, leaving Silas standing in a cloud of dust and resentment. Silas didn't feel lucky. He felt like a man standing on a small solid rock, watching a tidal wave build on the horizon, knowing it was about to sweep away everything and everyone around him. That winter, he finished clearing the last of the 40 acres of bottomland. The HD6, caked in mud and scarred from years of battle, had done its job. He parked it by the barn, a silent yellow sentinel. The land was ready. The question was, what was it ready for? The wave crashed in the spring of 1981. Interest rates, which had seemed impossibly high at 12%, surged past 18, then touched 20. The word on every farmer's lips was foreclosure. It started with the young guys, the ones who had jumped in headfirst during the boom years, buying land at $4,000 an acre with nothing but a promise and a signature. Their auction notices started appearing in the county paper, stark black and white announcements of failure. The community auctions were like funerals. Neighbors stood in grim-faced silence, their hats in their hands, as the auctioneer, a man they'd known their whole lives, sold off a family's heritage piece by piece. Tractors, planters, combines, the very tools of their identity, were driven onto a flatbed trailer and hauled away by strangers. Silas went to a few, not to buy, but to bear witness. He saw grown men weep openly as the auctioneer's hammer fell on the parcel of land their grandfathers had first broken with a team of mules. It was a hollowing out of the county's soul. Warren Slater fought like a cornered animal. He sold off his new John Deere 4630. He sold the grain in his bins at a massive loss just to make an interest payment. He tried to refinance, but no bank would touch him. The value of his land had collapsed. and he was now worth less on paper than what he owed. Mr. Abernathy, the banker who had once praised his aggressive expansion, now wouldn't even take his calls. The breaking point came during planting season. Slater's big Steiger tractor, the pride of his fleet, blew its engine. Not a simple overhaul, but a catastrophic failure. A thrown rod had punched a fist-sized hole right through the side of the engine block. The repair estimate was $20,000. Money he simply did not have. For weeks, the giant, useless tractor sat in his field, a monument to the fragility of his modern, debt-fueled operation. While Silas chugged along on his old Farmall M, planting his corn row by steady row, Slater's land, the land he had mortgaged his future to acquire, lay black and unplanted. The foreclosure notice on the Henderson place, the 80 acres next to Silas, was the first to be posted. Then the bank came for the 160 he'd bought from the old Johnson estate. They repossessed the combine, the planters, the discs. One by one, the symbols of his success were stripped away, leaving him with nothing but his original homestead and a mountain of debt he could never hope to repay. Silas survived. It wasn't easy. The price of corn was in the gutter, and the cost of fuel and fertilizer was sky high. He and Mary lived frugally, patching their clothes, canning everything from their garden, making do with what they had. But they survived. The farm was theirs. The house was theirs. The tractors in the shed, old and faded as they were theirs. The 30 acres of rich bottomland, now his most productive field, yielded just enough to keep them afloat, to pay their property taxes and buy the seeds for the next year. He had no payments. No banker could call him and demand a review of his financial position. In the midst of the worst agricultural crisis since the Great Depression, Silas Blackwood was a free man. He saw Slater in town one day. The swagger was gone, his shoulders were slumped, his face was gaunt, and his eyes had the haunted look of a man who had seen his whole world burn down around him. He was driving an old beat-up Ford Falcon, the fancy pickup truck long since repossessed. He didn't make eye contact. He just scurried into the grocery store, a phantom of the man he once was. There was no triumph in it for Silas, only a deep and profound sadness for a good farmer who had believed the wrong gospel, the gospel of debt. The final auction was for Warren Slater's home place, the 160 acres his great-grandfather had settled. It was a cold, blustery day in November of 1982. A small crowd gathered in the farmyard, their collars turned up against the wind. The remaining equipment, a motley collection of older, worn-out tools, was sold first for pennies on the dollar. Warren stood near the back of the crowd with his wife, his face as grey as the winter sky. He was watching the end of his family's story. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, stood at the front, looking uncomfortable. He was just the public face of a system that was chewing up and spitting out farmers across the heartland. The auctioneer began the sale of the land. "All right, folks, we're selling 160 acres, more or less, with house and outbuildings. A fine piece of ground. Who'll start the bidding at $500 an acre?" The silence was heavy. $500. Just a few years ago, this land would have brought $4,000. Now nobody had the money or the nerve. The farmers in the crowd looked at their boots. The only real bidders were a couple of out-of-state investors, vulture capitalists looking to pick the bones of the farm crisis. "500, I have 500, the auctioneer chanted, pointing at one of the investors. "Do I hear 6? The other investor nodded. 600. 700, the first one shot back. They were going to steal it. They were going to buy this land, this family's history, for a fraction of its worth, and likely rent it back to some other desperate farmer. Silas felt a slow burn of anger in his chest. He looked over at Slater, who had his arm around his wife, her body shaking with silent sobs. Silas had spent the last 2 years saving every penny. The income from the reclaimed bottomland wasn't much, but with no debts, it had accumulated in a savings account at the credit union. It was his buffer, his security against the hard times. It was the money he and Mary had set aside for their own old age. 800, Silas said, his voice clear and steady in the cold air. Every head in the crowd turned to look at him. Warren Slater's eyes widened in disbelief. Mr. Abernathy stared, his mouth slightly agape. The investor from out of town looked annoyed. "I have 800 from Silas Blackwood. Do I hear 9? The auctioneer asked, a new energy in his voice. 900, the investor grunted. 1,000, Silas said without hesitation. He had done the math in his head 100 times. He knew exactly how high he could go. The bidding went back and forth, the investors trying to push him out, but Silas stood his ground, his voice never wavering. He was a man made of the same stubborn material as the land he stood on. The price crept up. 1,200, 13. Finally, at $1,400 an acre, the investors shook their heads and backed away. 1,400 going once, twice, sold, the auctioneer cried, his hammer falling with a sharp crack that echoed across the empty farmyard. To Silas Blackwood. A quiet murmur went through the crowd. Silas didn't acknowledge them. He walked over to where Warren Slater was standing. Slater looked at him, his eyes filled with a confusing mix of shame, gratitude, and utter bewilderment. "Why, Silas?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "After everything, why?" "Because no man should have to watch his home be sold off to strangers," Silas said simply. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a lease agreement he'd had the lawyer in town draw up. "This is a crop share lease. You farm the land, you live in the house. You give me 1/3 of the crop to cover the taxes and the loan I'm about to take out to pay for this. The rest is yours. When you get back on your feet, if you want, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it. Not a penny more." Warren stared at the paper, then at Silas's outstretched hand. He couldn't speak. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. He simply nodded, taking the paper with a trembling hand. It wasn't a handout. It was a lifeline. It was a chance to start over, to reclaim his dignity, to work the land his family had always worked, free from the crushing weight of the bank. In the years that followed, the story of that auction became a local legend. Silas Blackwood, the stubborn old fool with his junkyard dozer, had become the conscience of the county. The community's perspective had shifted. They no longer saw progress in the gleam of new paint and the whine of a turbocharger. They saw it in a paid-for deed, in a well-maintained machine, no matter its age, in the quiet wisdom of a man who understood the difference between wealth and debt. Silas and Warren became unlikely friends. They worked side by side, Silas with his old farm awl, Warren with the older, smaller equipment he managed to piece together. They helped each other at harvest, shared tools, and spent long evenings in Silas's workshop, keeping the old iron running. Warren eventually did buy the farm back, 10 years later, paying Silas in full. Silas grew old, his hair turned white, and his hands, gnarled from a lifetime of work, became permanently stained with the grease and soil of his farm. He never got rich. He never bought a new tractor. But he and Mary lived a good life, a secure life, beholden to no one. He taught his son, Jed, everything he knew. He taught him how to listen to an engine and diagnose a problem by its sound. He taught him how to weld a clean bead and how to time an old distributor by feel. But the most important lessons had nothing to do with mechanics. One warm summer evening, Silas and a teenage Jed were standing by the old Alice Chalmers HD6. It hadn't run in years, but Silas kept it clean, a coat of yellow paint covering the scars of its former life. It sat by the barn like a retired champion. "See that machine, son?" Silas said, placing a hand on the cold steel of the blade. "Everyone in the county called it Silas's folly. They laughed at me, said I was living in the past." He looked out over the fields toward the 40 acres of bottomland, now lush with a thick stand of soybeans, the leaves shimmering in the setting sun. "That land down there, that's the best land we have, and that old dozer is what made it. It didn't come with a payment book. It didn't come with a banker's smile. It came with rust and work and busted knuckles. We brought it back to life with our own hands, and because of that, it was ours. Truly ours." He turned to his son, his eyes clear and direct. "Don't ever let a man convince you to trade your freedom for a monthly payment. You own the land, you own the iron, or they own you. It's as simple as that." Jed nodded, understanding the weight of the words. He looked from the old dozer to the rich fields it had created, and then to his father's weathered face. He was looking at his inheritance, not one of acres or dollars, but of a hard-won wisdom, forged in a scrapyard and proven in the crucible of hard times. The land would endure, the iron would rust, but the lesson would live forever.